The hemp rope cuts into his ankle so deeply that he can feel the fibers scraping against bone. Heinrich of Freiburg is 31 years old, and he hangs upside down from a wooden scaffold in the market square of Strasbourg. Can feel the blood rushing to his head with each heartbeat until his vision pulses red with every pump of his heart. Can smell the sawdust being scattered beneath him by an executioner's assistant who works with the casual efficiency of a craftsman preparing his workspace. Can hear the crowd gathering, hundreds of voices, perhaps thousands. The entire city coming to witness what the magistrates have promised will be the most spectacular execution in living memory. He was until 17 days ago a master blacksmith whose forge produced the finest blades in the Upper Rhine Valley, a guild member in good standing, a husband to a woman named Marga who is somewhere in this crowd, a father to 3 children who have been forbidden from attending but who will hear about what happens here for the rest of their lives. He owned a house near the cathedral. He employed 2 journeymen and an apprentice. He paid his taxes, attended mass, contributed to the city's defense when the walls needed repair. Now he hangs inverted between 2 wooden posts, his arms bound behind his back with leather straps that bite into his wrists, his legs spread apart and tied separately to the crossbeam above him. His body positioned precisely according to specifications that the executioner has followed many times before. The saw rests on a wooden stand beside him. He cannot turn his head far enough to see it clearly, but he glimpsed it when they were positioning him a 2-man timber saw with teeth the length of his thumb designed for cutting oak beams. Freshly sharpened this morning by a man who will use it to cut through Heinrich's body while Heinrich watches and feels every stroke. They will begin at the groin and work downward, which is to say upward since he is inverted. They will saw through him slowly, methodically, prolonging the process as long as possible. The position is deliberate. Hanging upside down forces blood to the brain, keeping the condemned conscious far longer than any other method would allow. Men have survived for hours during this procedure. Some have remained aware until the saw reached their navel. A few, and the executioner mentioned this with something like professional pride, have stayed conscious until the blade touched their sternum. Heinrich does not know how long he will last. He does not know if he will be able to maintain his dignity, to die without screaming, to give his family at least the memory of courage. He does not know if God will grant him the mercy of unconsciousness, or if he will be aware of every moment as his body is divided into 2 pieces and his organs spill onto the sawdust below. What he knows is that in approximately 15 minutes, 2 men will grip the handles of that saw and begin cutting him in half from the bottom up. What he knows is that his crime, the crime for which this punishment has been decreed, was refusing to forge weapons for an army he believed was marching toward unjust war. What he knows is that the magistrate who sentenced him is standing in the front row of the crowd, wearing ceremonial robes, waiting to watch Heinrich die for the crime of conscience. The executioner approaches. His name is Master Conrad, and he has performed this particular execution 11 times in his 30-year career. He is not cruel, he is professional. He views his work the way Heinrich once viewed his own, as a craft requiring skill, precision, and a certain detachment from the human implications of what he produces. "It is time," Master Conrad says. "Do you wish to make a final statement?" Heinrich's voice comes out strange, distorted by his inverted position, by the pressure of blood in his skull, by the fear he cannot entirely suppress. "I forgive those who condemned me. I ask forgiveness from those I have wronged. I commend my soul to God's mercy." The words are traditional, expected. They reveal nothing of what Heinrich actually feels, which is terror so profound that he can barely form coherent thoughts. But the ritual matters. The performance matters. His family will be told what he said, and he wants them to remember a man who faced death with the dignity befitting his station. Master Conrad nods. He gestures to his assistant, a younger man who takes position at one end of the saw. Master Conrad positions himself at the other end. "May God receive your soul," the executioner says. He grips the wooden handle. The saw teeth touch Heinrich's flesh, and what follows will take nearly 2 hours. What you are about to learn has been deliberately obscured from popular history for 500 years. We know about medieval executions. We have seen the Hollywood versions, quick beheadings, dramatic hangings, perhaps the occasional burning at the stake. We have a sanitized understanding of how medieval justice operated, filtered through entertainment that makes ancient cruelty seem almost romantic. But we do not know about the sawing. The sawing was considered the most extreme punishment available to medieval European courts. It was reserved for crimes so severe that ordinary execution was deemed insufficient treason, heresy, Reichside, and offenses against the social order so fundamental that the condemned person's suffering needed to be maximized as a warning to others. It was performed publicly always because the entire purpose was spectacle. It was designed not merely to kill, but to horrify, to demonstrate the absolute power of authority over the bodies of those who defied it. Tonight, you will learn exactly what this punishment involved. You will learn about the physiology that made it so prolonged, why hanging upside down extended consciousness, why the saw's progression was calibrated to maximize duration, why victims could survive for hours while being cut in half. You will learn about the legal framework that authorized such punishments, how courts justified them, how executioners were trained to perform them, how communities gathered to watch them. You will learn about Heinrich of Freiburg, who was 31 years old when he was sentenced to death by sawing for refusing to forge weapons for a military campaign he believed was unjust. You will learn about the 17 days between his sentencing and his execution, about what he experienced in the dungeon beneath Strasbourg's courthouse, about the men who would ultimately carry out his sentence. Subscribe if you want to understand this forgotten history. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Heinrich is hanging upside down in Strasbourg's Market Square, and the saw has just touched his body, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened during the next 2 hours. What the witnesses recorded, what the medical realities were, what it meant to die in a way that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to public violence. But first, I need to warn you, this is not entertainment violence. This is not sanitized history. This is what actually happened to real human beings under legal systems that our civilization inherited and built upon. The punishment I am about to describe was considered lawful. It was performed by officers of the court. It was witnessed by ordinary citizens who brought their families to watch. Understanding this history requires confronting what human beings are capable of doing to each other when authority is absolute and cruelty is institutionalized. I am going to tell you the truth. Let us begin. The sawing punishment, known in German as Zerrigen, in French as Le Chouple's Diacy, and in Latin as dissectio peroram, has origins that trace back to antiquity. But it reached its fullest development in medieval Europe between the 12th and 17th centuries. The method was not improvised, it was systematized. Execution manuals from the period describe the procedure in clinical detail, specifying the type of saw to be used, a two-man timber saw with coarse teeth. The positioning of the condemned, inverted, legs spread, secured at ankles and occasionally at thighs. The starting point, the groin, proceeding toward the head, and the expected duration between 1 and 4 hours, depending on the condemned physical constitution and the executioner's skill. The physics of the punishment were understood and deliberately exploited. When a human body is inverted, gravity forces blood toward the head. The heart continues pumping, but now it is pumping downward rather than upward, which means blood accumulates in the brain rather than draining from it. This keeps the condemned conscious far longer than would otherwise be possible during traumatic injury. A person being sawed while hanging right side up would lose consciousness within minutes as blood drained from their brain. A person being sawed while inverted might remain aware for hours. Medical historians who have analyzed the procedure estimate that consciousness could be maintained until the saw reached approximately the navel, the point at which blood loss became catastrophic enough to overcome the effects of inversion. This meant the condemned would be aware as the saw cut through their groin, their lower abdomen, their intestines, their stomach. They would feel the blad's progress. They would see their own organs falling onto the sawdust below. Modern trauma surgeons who have reviewed the historical accounts confirm that the physiological descriptions are accurate. The inverted position does extend consciousness during massive trauma. The progression of the saw would indeed allow prolonged awareness. The descriptions of victims speaking, screaming, praying, and cursing as the blade worked through their bodies are medically plausible. This was not accidental. The executioners knew exactly what they were doing. They had refined the technique over generations, learning through experience which positions maximized suffering, which saw strokes prolonged duration, which approaches kept the condemned alive and aware as long as possible. The punishment existed because the suffering was the point. Let me tell you now about the legal system that authorized such punishments. Medieval European justice operated on principles fundamentally different from modern legal philosophy. The purpose of punishment was not rehabilitation. The concept barely existed. The purpose was not even primarily deterrence, though that was certainly a consideration. The primary purpose was retribution, and crucially the public demonstration of sovereign power. The body of the criminal belonged to the authority that judged him. The suffering inflicted on that body was a message to the condemned, certainly, but more importantly to everyone who witnessed the execution. The message was simple. This is what happens to those who defy legitimate authority. This is what the state can do to you. This is the power that maintains social order. The more severe the crime, the more spectacular the punishment needed to be. For ordinary crimes, theft, assault, minor fraud, hanging was sufficient, quick, efficient, and deadly. For more serious crimes, murder, rape, arson, additional elements might be added. The condemned might be broken on the wheel first, their limbs shattered before they were hanged. They might be partially disemboweled, forced to watch their own organs removed before death. They might be burned either alive or after strangling. For the most severe crimes, treason, heresy, Reichside, offenses against the fundamental order of society, the punishment needed to be extraordinary. The sawing fell into this category. So did some forms of quartering, of impalement, of flaying. These were punishments designed to exceed normal human comprehension of suffering, to create spectacles so horrifying that witnesses would carry the memory forever. The legal justification was theological as much as political. Medieval Christianity taught that punishment in this life could reduce punishment in the afterlife. A sinner who suffered greatly before death might thereby satisfy some portion of the debt owed to divine justice. The executioner in this framework was not merely an agent of the state, but a servant of God's justice, helping the condemned make payment for their sins. This theology made extreme punishment seem almost merciful. Yes, the suffering was terrible, but it was finite. It ended with death. The suffering of hell was infinite. If worldly torture could reduce eternal damnation, then torture was actually a kindness, a final gift to the condemned soul. The condemned were expected to cooperate with this framework. They were supposed to confess their sins, accept their punishment, forgive those who had sentenced them, and die expressing hope for salvation. The ritual phrases that Heinrich spoke, "I forgive those who condemned me. I commend my soul to God's mercy," were not spontaneous expressions of personal faith. They were required performances, scripts that the condemned were expected to follow regardless of their actual beliefs. Those who refused to follow the script, who died cursing the authorities, denying their guilt, or expressing despair about their salvation, were sometimes punished even further. Their bodies might be denied burial, left to rot publicly as additional warning. Their families might face social or legal consequences for the condemned's failure to die properly. The system was comprehensive. It governed not only how people were killed, but how they were expected to behave while being killed. Heinrich of Freiburg had been a master blacksmith for 11 years when the dispute began. The year was 1431, and the political situation in the Upper Rhine Valley was volatile. The Holy Roman Empire was fracturing along religious and political lines that would eventually produce decades of warfare. Local lords were raising armies, demanding supplies, conscripting craftsmen to produce weapons for conflicts whose justifications were murky at best. The Margrave of Baden had sent commissioners to Strasbourg, demanding that the city's guilds contribute to his military preparations. The Blacksmiths' Guild was ordered to produce 500 swords, 200 halberds, and assorted pole arms within 90 days. The order came with promises of payment that everyone understood were unlikely to be honored and threats of consequences that everyone understood were very real. Most of the smiths complied. They had families. They had businesses. They understood that defying a Margrave's direct order was dangerous regardless of the order's legitimacy. Heinrich refused. His reasons were complex, rooted in his understanding of Christian ethics and his assessment of the Margrave's claims. The military campaign being planned was, in Heinrich's judgment, a war of aggression against neighboring territories whose populations had done nothing to deserve invasion. The theological doctrines he had absorbed taught that participating in unjust warfare was sinful, that crafting weapons for an unjust cause made the craftsman complicit in whatever sins those weapons enabled. He explained this to the guild masters. He explained it to the city magistrates. He explained it to the Margarav's commissioners when they came to demand compliance. "I'm a Christian," Hinrich said in words recorded by a clerk who was present at the hearing. "I will not forge weapons for a war that has no just cause. Find another smith. I would rather suffer any punishment than bear the weight of innocent blood." The commissioners reported his refusal to the Margrave. The Margrave communicated his displeasure to the Strawberg City Council. The City Council, caught between a powerful lord's demands and a citizen's obstinance, chose the path of least resistance. Heinrich was arrested on charges of sedition and contempt of lawful authority. The trial lasted 3 days. Heinrich defended himself ali, citing scripture and theological authorities to support his position. Several clergy testified on his behalf, confirming that his understanding of just war doctrine was at least defensible, if not necessarily correct. Character witnesses attested to his previous loyalty, his contributions to the community, his reputation for honest dealing. None of it mattered. The magistrate who presided, a man named Vera von Hungerstein, had received instructions from the city council, who had received pressure from the Margrave. Heinrich's guilt was predetermined. The only question was the severity of the punishment. The prosecution argued for maximum severity. Heinrich's refusal was not merely disobedience, it was public defiance that might inspire others to similar resistance. If one craftsman could refuse military orders on grounds of conscience, every craftsman might claim the same privilege. The social order depended on obedience. Heinrich's example needed to be made unforgettable. The defense argued for mercy. Heinrich was a productive citizen with no prior offenses. His refusal was based on sincere religious conviction, not personal rebellion. A lesser punishment, imprisonment, exile, confiscation of property, would satisfy justice without destroying a valuable member of the community. Vera von Hungerstein listened to both arguments, retired to consider his verdict, and returned the following morning. Heinrich of Freiburg, the magistrate pronounced, "You have been found guilty of sedition, contempt of lawful authority, and refusal to support the defense of the realm. Your crime is not merely disobedience. Your crime is the assertion that your individual conscience supersedes the lawful commands of those whom God has placed in authority over you. This is heresy of a political nature, and it requires exemplary punishment." He paused, allowing the words to settle over the crowded courtroom. "You are sentenced to death by the saw. The execution will take place in 17 days on the feast of St. Bartholomew in the market square of the city, as warning to all who might consider following your example." The feast of St. Bartholomew, August 24th, was deliberately chosen. St. Bartholomew had been martyred by flaying, his skin removed while he was still alive. The connection between the saint's death and Heinrich's punishment was intentional, a theological reference that would not be lost on the medieval audience. Heinrich heard the sentence and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The decision was final. In 17 days, he would be sawed in half in front of everyone he knew. The guards took him to the dungeon beneath the courthouse to await his execution. The dungeon beneath Strawberg's courthouse had been constructed in the 13th century, expanded in the 14th, and refined throughout the 15th into a complex designed for the management of condemned prisoners. The cells were small, perhaps 8 ft by 8 ft, with stone walls, stone floors, and wooden doors reinforced with iron bands. Light came from small windows set high in the walls, providing dim illumination for a few hours each day and total darkness otherwise. The cells were cold in winter, stifling in summer, and damp year-round from water that seeped through the ancient stone. Heinrich was placed in a cell reserved for prisoners awaiting execution. It was slightly better than the cells for ordinary prisoners, larger, with a wooden sleeping platform rather than bare stone, with a bucket that was emptied daily rather than weekly. These amenities were not kindness, they were preservation. Condemned prisoners needed to arrive at their executions in physical condition to endure them. A prisoner who died of cold or disease before the scheduled date represented a failure of the system. The first visitor was a priest named Father Johannes, assigned to prepare Heinrich's soul for death. Father Johannes was perhaps 50 years old, gay-bearded, with eyes that suggested he had performed this duty many times before. He brought bread, wine, and a small wooden cross. He sat on the sleeping platform beside Heinrich and spoke in the gentle tone of someone delivering terrible news that could not be softened. "My son," Father Johannes said, "you have 17 days remaining in this world. I am here to help you use that time. Well, will you hear my confession? I will hear whatever you wish to tell me. But first, I must explain what will be expected of you, not by God, but by the men who will kill you. Father Johannes described the execution procedure in clinical detail. He explained the positioning, the saw, the expected duration. He explained what would happen to Heinrich's body during the process, which organs would be affected, at which points when consciousness might be lost, what physical sensations might be experienced. He explained this not from cruelty, but from pastoral concern. Men who understood what awaited them could prepare themselves mentally. Men who were surprised by the reality often broke down in ways that damaged their souls and their families' memories of them. Most men scream. Father Johannes said, "You should not be ashamed if you scream. It is natural, it is human. God does not judge you for the sounds your body makes under torture. He judges only the disposition of your soul. How do I endure it? You do not endure it. No one endures it. You survive as long as you survive, and then you die, and then it is over. What matters is what happens in your mind while your body is being destroyed. You can choose to fill your final hours with hatred and despair, or you can choose to fill them with prayer and acceptance. The choice is yours, perhaps the only choice that remains to you." Heinrich absorbed this. "And my family, what will happen to them? They will be permitted to collect your remains for burial, assuming you die properly. They will not be punished for your crime." The magistrate was clear on that point. "They will face social difficulties. Certainly, the widow and children of a man sored for sedition do not find easy welcome in respectable company, but they will live. They will survive. They may eventually rebuild. If I die properly," Father Johannes hesitated. "If you die cursing God or the authorities, if you deny your guilt or proclaim yourself a martyr, if you give the crowd any reason to believe you died unrepentant, then the church may refuse burial. Your body may be left for the animals. Your family may face additional scrutiny, so I must perform. Even while being sawed in half, I must perform. Yes, that is the final cruelty of this punishment. It takes not only your life but your dignity. It gives you a choice between dying with apparent acceptance or dying in a way that harms those you leave behind. There is no third option." Heinrich understood. The system was complete. Even his death was scripted. Even his suffering would be shaped by considerations of what came after. "I will try to die well," he said, "for my family's sake, if not for my own." Father Johannes nodded. "That is all anyone can ask. Now shall we pray?" They prayed together for the remainder of the visit. When Father Johannes left, Heinrich was alone with 17 days of waiting and the knowledge of exactly what those days were counting toward. Let me tell you now about the executioner who would carry out Heinrich's sentence. Master Conrad of Strawber was one of the most respected executioners in the Holy Roman Empire. His family had held the position for 4 generations. His great-grandfather, grandfather and father had all served as Strawber's official executioners before him. He had inherited not only the position, but the accumulated knowledge of how to kill human beings in every manner authorized by law. Executioners in medieval Europe occupied a strange social position. They were necessary. No system of justice could function without someone willing to carry out sentences. They were often wealthy executioners, received fees for each execution, plus income from related duties like operating torture chambers and disposing of animal carcasses. But they were also social outcasts. Infamous in the legal sense, barred from many civic activities, required to live in designated areas, forbidden from eating or drinking with respectable citizens. Master Conrad had performed over 200 executions in his career. Most were hangings, the routine work of criminal justice. Some were beheadings reserved for nobles, and others whose status entitled them to quick death. A few dozen were burnings, breakings, or other spectacular punishments requiring special skill. He had performed the sawing 11 times. Each sawing was memorable in its own way. The first, when he was 23 and newly inherited his position, had almost defeated him. The condemned man's screaming had been so intense that Conrad had nearly stopped the procedure, which would have been a professional catastrophe. He had learned to detach his emotions from his work, to view the human body as material to be processed rather than a person to be pied. The sawing required particular detachment because of its duration. A hanging took seconds. Beheading took 1 stroke if done correctly. Even a burning, though horrific, rarely lasted more than 30 minutes. But a sawing lasted hours. The executioner had to maintain focus and technique throughout, adjusting the pace to keep the condemned alive as long as possible while still making steady progress. Too fast and death came too quickly, a failure that might anger the authorities. too slow, and the condemned might actually die of shock before the saw reached vital organs. Another failure. The skill lay in finding the pace that maximized duration while still completing the procedure. Master Conrad prepared for Heinrich's execution with the same methodical attention he brought to all his work. He selected the saw, a two-man timber saw with teeth freshly filed to optimal sharpness. He tested the edge on a pig carcass, confirming that it cut cleanly through flesh and bone without catching or binding. He prepared the scaffold, two vertical posts with a horizontal crossbeam, ropes for securing the condemned, a platform for the executioners to stand on. He arranged for sawdust several bushels to absorb the blood and viscera that would fall during the procedure. He confirmed that his assistant, a journeyman executioner named Friedrich, understood his role and was prepared to maintain steady rhythm throughout. The night before the execution, Master Conrad visited Heinrich in his cell. This was not required, but Conrad made a practice of meeting condemned prisoners before major executions. It helped him understand what he would be dealing with, whether the prisoner was likely to cooperate or resist, whether special measures might be needed to maintain control. Heinrich looked up as the executioner entered. He had been in the dungeon for 16 days. He was thinner than when he had arrived, paler with dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleep had been difficult. But his gaze was steady. Master Conrad, Heinrich said, I wondered if you would come. I always come. It is better for both of us if we understand each other. What do you want me to understand? That I take no pleasure in what I do, that I am a craftsman performing a duty assigned to me by lawful authority, that I will do my work as professionally as possible with the minimum of unnecessary suffering that the sentence allows. The minimum of unnecessary suffering. Heinrich repeated the phrase flatly. You are going to saw me in half over the course of 2 hours, and you speak of minimizing unnecessary suffering. The sentence requires the sawing. I cannot change that, but I can ensure the saw is sharp, the strokes are clean, the process is as efficient as the duration requirements allow. I can ensure you are not tormented beyond what the punishment requires. Some executioners, he paused, some executioners take pleasure in their work. I do not. Is that supposed to comfort me? No, nothing I say can comfort you. I am simply explaining who I am and how I approach my work. You deserve to know who will kill you. Heinrich was silent for a long moment. Then tell me honestly, how long will I remain conscious? That depends on your constitution. Strong men last longer than weak ones. Men who fight and struggle exhaust themselves faster than men who remain calm. Based on my experience, Conrad paused, calculating, perhaps 90 minutes, perhaps 2 hours. It is difficult to predict precisely. And when I lose consciousness, will I die quickly after that? Relatively quickly. Once consciousness is lost, the body typically fails within 15 to 20 minutes. The total duration from first stroke to confirmed death is usually between 2 and 2 hours. Heinrich absorbed this information. He had asked for honesty and he had received it. Thank you, he said finally, for telling me the truth. I would rather know than imagine. Master Conrad nodded. Is there anything I can do for you within the constraints of my position? Yes, my wife will be in the crowd. Margara, she has brown hair. She will be wearing blue. She will be near the front because she insists on bearing witness. When it is over, when I am dead, tell her that I did not suffer more than necessary. Tell her that I was brave. Whether it is true or not, tell her that. I will tell her, thank you. The executioner rose to leave. At the door, he turned back. For what it is worth, I have read the transcript of your trial. Your reasons for refusing the Margarav's order were coherent. Your understanding of just war doctrine was sound. In different circumstances, you might have been honored rather than condemned. But these are the circumstances we have. Yes, these are the circumstances we have. I will see you tomorrow, Heinrich of Freiburg. He left. Heinrich was alone with his final night on earth. Execution was scheduled for noon on August 24, 1431. By mid-morning, the market square was packed with spectators. The population of Strasbourg was approximately 20,000. Estimates suggested that nearly half the city turned out for the sawing. They came from every class, nobles in their finery, watching from rented balconies, merchants and craftsmen filling the square itself, servants and laborers crowding the edges and climbing on rooftops for better views. The atmosphere was festive. Vendors sold food and drink. Musicians played. Children ran between adults' legs, too young to understand what they were about to witness, but caught up in the excitement of the crowd. This was entertainment, the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster spectacle. Everyone wanted to see the man who had defied the Margrave get sawed in half. Margarath found a position near the scaffold, as Heinrich had predicted. She wore blue, her best dress, the one Heinrich had bought her for their 10th anniversary. Her face was pale but composed. She had decided that she would not look away. Her husband was going to die watching her. She would give him a familiar face to focus on during his final hours. The priests arrived first, processing through the crowd in their vestments, chanting prayers that the noise of the crowd largely drowned out. They positioned themselves beside the scaffold, ready to offer final spiritual comfort to the condemned. Then the magistrate arrived, Baron Hungerstein in his ceremonial robes, taking his position in the front row, where Heinrich would be able to see him throughout the execution. The man who had pronounced the sentence would witness its fulfillment. Then the executioners, Master Conrad and his assistant Friedrich, dressed in the traditional red robes of their profession, carrying the tools of their trade. The saw had been carried separately, covered with cloth until the moment of use. When Master Conrad removed the covering and held the saw aloft for the crowd to see, a murmur rippled through the spectators. The blade gleamed in the summer sunlight, freshly sharpened, teeth promising what was to come. Finally, Heinrich. He was brought from the dungeon in chains, escorted by guards who kept him upright when he stumbled on the cobblestones. He had not slept. He had barely eaten. He had spent his final night in prayer and in writing letters to his family that would be delivered after his death. He looked, witnesses later recorded, like a man already dead, pale, hollow-eyed, moving through a world he had already left. The crowd's noise dropped to a murmur as he was led to the scaffold. People craned their necks for better views. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. The moment everyone had come to see was about to arrive. The guards stripped Heinrich of his clothing, another element of the humiliation, exposing him naked before the crowd. They positioned him on the scaffold, forcing him to lie face down on the wooden platform while they bound his wrists and ankles. Then they lifted him using a system of ropes and pulleys until he hung inverted between the two vertical posts. The positioning took several minutes. The ropes had to be adjusted to spread his legs properly. The height had to be calibrated so that the executioners could work comfortably. The crossbeam had to be tested to ensure it would hold his weight throughout the procedure. Heinrich hung there upside down while these preparations were completed. The blood rushed to his head, his vision blurred, then clarified, then blurred again. The crowd appeared inverted to him, faces watching from below, the sky beneath his feet, the world turned upside down in preparation for his death. When the preparations were complete, Master Conrad stepped forward for the ritual exchange. Heinrich of Freiburg, you have been condemned by lawful authority to death by the saw. Do you acknowledge the justice of this sentence? The script required him to say yes. The system demanded his cooperation even now. Heinrich looked at the crowd, found Margareth's face, held her gaze for a moment, then looked at von Hungerstein, standing in his ceremonial robes. I acknowledge that I have been sentenced, Heinrich said. I do not acknowledge that the sentence is just. I maintain that my refusal was required by conscience and by Christian duty. I go to God's judgment with hope for mercy. I leave earthly judgment to those who must answer for their own decisions. It was not the script. It was defiance, mild defiance, carefully worded to avoid the worst consequences, but defiance nonetheless. The magistrate's face tightened. Master Conrad glanced at him, received a slight nod, and continued, Do you wish to make a final statement? I forgive those who condemned me. I ask forgiveness from those I have wronged. I commend my soul to God's mercy. The traditional words spoken after the untraditional ones. Heinrich was threading a needle, asserting his innocence while still performing enough of the script to protect his family. Master Conrad accepted this compromise. He turned to the crowd. Let all who witness this execution remember that this is the fate of those who defy lawful authority. Let the punishment serve as warning to any who might consider similar defiance. He turned back to the scaffold, nodded to Friedrich, and both executioners took their positions at the saw's handles. Master Conrad looked at Heinrich one final time. May God receive your soul. The saw bit into flesh. I need to stop here and explain what the witnesses actually recorded about what followed. Multiple accounts of this execution survive, written by spectators who were present in the crowd. Some are brief notations in chronicles, some are more detailed descriptions in letters. One is an extensive account written by a priest who was positioned near the scaffold and who recorded the execution in detail as part of his duties. What these accounts describe is consistent with other records of sawing executions from the same period. The procedure followed a predictable pattern, and the witnesses recorded what they saw with varying degrees of clinical detachment. The initial cut produced immediate and intense vocalization from the condemned. Hinrich screamed a sound that witnesses described as unlike any human sound they had heard before. A scream that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the throat, from the core of the body itself. The executioners maintained a steady rhythm, pulling the saw back and forth in strokes of approximately 2 ft each. With each stroke, the blade bit deeper. With each stroke, blood flowed more freely, dripping onto the sawdust below, creating a widening pool of crimson beneath the inverted body. Hinrich screamed for the first several minutes continuously. Then his screaming became intermittent periods of vocalization, alternating with periods of apparent speechlessness when the pain exceeded even the capacity to scream. Witnesses described him making sounds that were not quite screaming, groaning, whimpering, grunting, sounds that suggested consciousness was becoming fragmentary. The executioners reached the pelvic bone approximately 20 minutes into the procedure. Bone required more effort than flesh. The saw strokes became shorter, harder, the sound of the blade changing from the wet noise of cutting meat to the grinding noise of cutting through dense material. This phase took longer. Hinrich's vocalizations during this phase were described as animal-like sounds without words, without apparent consciousness, pure physiological response to trauma. The saw cleared the pelvis approximately 45 minutes into the procedure. Beyond the pelvis was the abdominal cavity, organs unprotected by bone, soft tissue that the saw moved through more quickly. This was when the viscera began to fall. Witnesses described the crowd's reaction to this phase in various ways. Some spectators looked away, some vomited, some watched with apparent fascination. Children in the crowd were sometimes shielded by parents. Other parents deliberately kept their children watching, explaining that this was what happened to criminals and they needed to see it to understand. Hinrich was still alive at this point, still conscious. According to the witness accounts, his eyes were open. He was still making sounds, quieter now, weaker, but recognizably human. He appeared to be trying to speak, though the witnesses could not make out words. The saw reached the stomach approximately 70 minutes into the procedure. Hinrich's vocalizations ceased around this time. His eyes remained open, but witnesses described them as empty, present, but no longer seeing, no longer reflecting the presence of conscious awareness behind them. Master Conrad paused the procedure at this point and checked for signs of life. He found a pulse, found breath, found evidence that the body continued to function despite the catastrophic trauma. He resumed the sawing. The saw reached the diaphragm approximately 90 minutes into the procedure. At this point, the chest cavity began to open. The heart was visible, still beating, a detail that multiple witnesses noted with apparent amazement. The lungs were visible, still moving, though their movement was becoming irregular, faltering. Master Conrad paused again, checked for consciousness, found none. He checked for vital signs, found heartbeat still present but weakening. He resumed the sawing. The saw reached the sternum approximately 110 minutes into the procedure. Heinrich's heart stopped during the cutting of the sternum, the direct trauma to the heart itself, ending what remained of physiological function. Master Conrad checked for vital signs one final time, found none, and declared the execution complete. Total duration 117 minutes, nearly 2 hours from the first stroke to confirmed death. The crowd began to disperse. Vendors continued selling food and drink to those who lingered. Children were taken home with lessons about what happened to those who defied authority. The spectacle was over. Margaret remained until the guards cut down her husband's body, now in 2 pieces, and loaded it onto a cart for burial. She did not weep. She did not speak. She simply stood and watched until there was nothing left to see. Master Conrad approached her before she left. "Your husband asked me to tell you something," the executioner said. "He asked me to tell you that he did not suffer more than necessary. He asked me to tell you that he was brave." Margaret looked at the executioner for a long moment. "Was he?" she asked. "Was he brave?" Master Conrad hesitated. Then he did not beg. He did not curse God. He maintained his position until the end. By the standards of this punishment, yes, he was brave. Margaret nodded. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the dispersing crowd. She would never speak publicly about what she witnessed that day. She would raise her children, manage what remained of the family business, eventually remarry a widower who needed someone to help raise his own children. She would live another 34 years. But but those who knew her said she was never quite the same after August 24, 1431. Something had been taken from her in that market square, something that could not be named or measured, but that left her permanently diminished. Let me tell you now about 4 other men who were executed by sawing in the same region during the same period. Understanding Heinrich's story requires understanding that he was not unique. The sawing was rare, but it was not unprecedented. The system that killed him had killed others before and would kill others after. Ulrich of Constance was 29 years old when he was sawed in 1419 for the crime of counterfeiting. He had produced false coins using skills he had learned as a legitimate metal worker, flooding the local economy with debased currency that undermined trust in the monetary system. The authorities considered this crime against the social order severe enough to warrant maximum punishment. Ulrich's execution lasted approximately 90 minutes. Witnesses described him as particularly vocal. His screaming continued longer than average, suggesting either unusual pain tolerance or unusual difficulty accepting his fate. He died without making the expected statements of forgiveness and acceptance. His final recorded words were curses directed at the magistrate who had sentenced him. His body was denied church burial and was left in the market square for 3 days before being dumped in an unmarked pit outside the city walls. Conrad of Basel was 34 years old when he was sawed in 1427 for the crime of attempting to poison the city's water supply. He had been hired by enemies of Basel to contaminate the wells during a period of political conflict. His plan was discovered before it could be executed, but the intent was deemed sufficiently serious to warrant execution by sawing. Conrad's execution lasted approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes longer than average, attributed by the executioner to Conrad's exceptional physical strength. He remained conscious and vocally responsive until approximately the 90-minute mark, longer than most condemned men. He died making the expected statements of forgiveness and acceptance. His body was returned to his family for burial. Friedrich of Speyer was 41 years old when he was sawed in 1430 for the crime of heresy. He had preached doctrines deemed inconsistent with church teaching, attracted a following among the urban poor, and refused multiple opportunities to recant. The church condemned him. The civil authorities carried out the sentence. Friedrich's execution was unusual because he sang hymns throughout much of the procedure. Witnesses described him maintaining vocal performance, somewhat ragged, interrupted by screaming, but recognizable as him singing for approximately the first hour. His singing ceased when the saw reached his abdomen, but his final words, spoken approximately 80 minutes into the execution, were reportedly, "Lord, receive my spirit." His body was burned after death to prevent the creation of relics that his followers might venerate. Georg of Mainz was 26 years old when he was sawed in 1435, 4 years after Heinrich, for the crime of murdering a priest. The murder had been committed during a robbery. Georg had killed Father Wilhelm of St. Stephen's Parish while stealing church valuables. The combination of murder, robbery, and sacrilege triggered the maximum penalty. Georg's execution lasted only approximately 70 minutes shorter than average, attributed by the executioner to Georg's poor physical condition at the time of execution. He had been tortured extensively before trial to extract confession, and his body was weakened by the damage inflicted during interrogation. He died screaming rather than praying. His body was denied burial and was displayed publicly until it decomposed. These 4 men plus Heinrich represent the documented sawing executions in the Upper Rhine region during the first half of the 15th century. 5 men, 5 different crimes, 5 different variations on the same punishment. What connects them is the system that killed them. The legal framework, the theological justification, the professional executioners, the public spectacle. Each man was individual. The system that processed them was standardized, and each man left behind people who had to continue living after watching what was done to them. Modern psychologists who study trauma recognize specific patterns in how communities process public executions. Witnesses to extreme violence, especially violence that is prolonged, systematic, and publicly sanctioned, experience effects that can persist for years or decades. These effects include intrusive memories, hypervigilance, difficulty forming trust, and altered beliefs about human nature and social institutions. The effects are particularly pronounced in witnesses who had close relationships with the condemned. Margareta Heinrich's wife would have experienced what modern clinicians call traumatic grief bereavement, complicated by the traumatic circumstances of the death. Her symptoms would likely have included re-experiencing phenomena, flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance behaviors, inability to return to the market square, difficulty discussing what happened, and negative alterations in mood and cognition, depression, difficulty finding meaning, persistent negative beliefs about the world. But the effects extended beyond close relations. Communities that regularly witnessed public executions developed what historians call cultures of violence, normalized acceptance of extreme cruelty as legitimate response to social deviance. Children who grew up watching sawings, burnings, and breakings learned that such practices were normal, acceptable, even entertaining. The spectacle was designed to instill fear of authority. It also instilled desensitization to suffering. The psychological research suggests that this desensitization had long-term consequences. Communities with frequent public executions showed higher rates of interpersonal violence, lower rates of cooperative behavior, and reduced capacity for empathy. In subsequent generations, the trauma of witnessing was passed down, shaping attitudes and behaviors even in people who had not directly witnessed executions themselves. This is the hidden legacy of medieval justice. Not just the individuals who died, but the communities that watched them die. Communities that were changed by what they witnessed, that carried the trauma forward into generations that would eventually build the modern world. We are the descendants of those communities. We inherited their institutions, their legal concepts, their assumptions about crime and punishment. We also inherited in ways that psychological research is still exploring the trauma they accumulated through centuries of spectacular public violence. Understanding Heinrich's death requires understanding what his death did to everyone who watched it. The sawing was designed to send a message. The message was received, and it echoed through time in ways its designers never anticipated. What happened to the people Heinrich left behind? Margareta, as I mentioned, remarried and lived another 34 years. She never spoke publicly about the execution, but private letters that survived suggest she was haunted by what she witnessed. She described recurring nightmares in which she heard the saw, smelled the blood, watched Heinrich's face as consciousness gradually departed. These nightmares persisted throughout her life. Heinrich's 3 children were aged 12, 9, and 6 at the time of his execution. They were forbidden from attending, but they heard about it from classmates, from neighbors, from the entire city that had witnessed their father's death. The eldest, a son named Johannes, eventually became a blacksmith like his father. He inherited Heinrich's tools, reopened the forge, and spent his life trying to restore the family's reputation. He never spoke about his father's execution, but he named his own first son Heinrich, a quiet memorial to the man the system had destroyed. The middle child, a daughter named Katharina, married young and moved to a different city where the family name was not known. She seems to have successfully escaped her father's shadow. Records suggest she lived a relatively normal life, raised children, died in old age. Whether she carried internal scars that the historical record cannot capture, we cannot know. The youngest, a son named Peter, did not fare as well. Records indicate he had difficulty throughout his life, trouble holding employment, conflicts with authority, periods of what documents describe as melancholy that may indicate depression. He died at 32 under circumstances that the records do not clarify, but that some historians interpret as possible suicide. The family's trajectory illustrates how trauma ripples outward from its initial point of impact. Heinrich was the one who died, but his death affected everyone connected to him. Wife, children, grandchildren, the entire network of relationships that his existence had sustained. Master Conrad, the executioner, lived for another 23 years after Heinrich's execution. He performed approximately 150 more executions during that time, including 2 more sawings. He trained his own son to succeed him, passing down the family trade as his father and grandfather had done. He died in bed at 72, relatively wealthy, relatively respected within the limited social sphere that executioners occupied. His personal feelings about his work are not recorded. Executioners rarely left personal documents. Their social position discouraged literacy and self-reflection. But the fact that he visited condemned prisoners before major executions, that he delivered messages to their families afterward suggests at least some capacity for human connection with the people he killed. Whether he experienced guilt, whether he had nightmares, whether the faces of the men he killed haunted his final years, we cannot know. The system that employed him did not care about his inner life. It cared only that he performed his duties professionally. Vera von Hungerstein, the magistrate who sentenced Hinrich, lived for another 17 years. He continued serving as a judge, pronouncing sentences on countless other defendants, sending men and women to deaths, both spectacular and routine. He rose in prominence, eventually becoming one of the most influential legal officials in the region. He is not recorded as ever expressing doubt about any of his judgments. The legal framework he operated within did not encourage doubt. Judges were instruments of divine justice, applying laws that reflected eternal moral truths. Questioning a judgment was questioning God's order. When he died, his funeral was attended by the city's most prominent citizens. His epitaph praised his commitment to justice, his defense of social order, his decades of faithful service. Hinrich's name did not appear anywhere in the memorial. The Margrave of Boden, whose military demands had triggered the entire conflict, went on to fight his war. The weapons that Strasbourg smiths produced, including the weapons that Heinrich had refused to forge, equipped an army that invaded neighboring territories and killed thousands. The war lasted 3 years, accomplished little of lasting significance, and was largely forgotten within a generation. The Margrave died in 1441, 10 years after Heinrich's execution. He was mourned as a defender of his realm, a patron of the arts, a man of significant accomplishment. The blacksmith who had refused to support his war was not mentioned in any account of the Margrave's life or death. History remembered the powerful and forgot the principled. What does Heinrich's story tell us about medieval justice and its legacy? It tells us that the systems we inherited were built on spectacular violence. The legal frameworks that eventually evolved into modern criminal justice began as systems designed to terrorize populations into obedience. The public execution was not an aberration. It was the centerpiece of how justice was understood to work. The suffering of the condemned was not regrettable collateral damage. It was the primary product that the system was designed to create. It tells us that conscience was dangerous. Heinrich died because he refused to participate in what he believed was unjust. His refusal threatened a system that depended on obedience. Not just individual obedience, but the principle of obedience, the idea that authorities' commands must be followed regardless of their moral content. By asserting that his conscience superseded the Margrave's orders, Hinrich challenged the foundation of the social order. His punishment was designed to demonstrate that no individual conscience could stand against collective authority. It tells us that resistance has costs. Heinrich's refusal was principled, coherent, and arguably correct on its own terms. His understanding of just war doctrine was sound. His belief that Christians should not participate in unjust warfare had strong theological support, but being right did not protect him. Being principled did not save him. The system did not care about the validity of his position. It cared about the threat his defiance represented. And it tells us that memory matters. Heinrich's name has been forgotten for nearly 600 years. His story survived only in fragmentary records, court documents, execution accounts, brief mentions, and chronicles. Until recently, no one had assembled these fragments into a coherent narrative. No one had told his story as a story rather than as historical data. But he existed, he lived, he refused, he suffered, he died. His death affected everyone who witnessed it and everyone connected to him. His memory was carried, however dimly, through generations that eventually produced us. Forgetting him is easy. Remembering him requires effort. But the effort matters because remembering the victims of historical injustice is how we acknowledge that injustice was real, that it happened to real people, that the systems we inherited were built on their suffering. The sawing punishment continued to be used in Europe until the 17th century. The last documented sawing in the Holy Roman Empire occurred in 1636. The last documented sawing in France occurred in 1648. By the 18th century, the punishment had been abolished throughout most of Europe, replaced by methods considered more humane or at least more efficient. The reasons for abolition were complex. Enlightenment philosophers argued that spectacular punishments were barbaric, ineffective, and unworthy of civilized societies. Legal reformers contended that punishment should be proportionate to crime and that extreme torture violated natural law. Religious thinkers increasingly questioned whether earthly suffering actually reduced divine punishment, undermining the theological justification for torture. But the change was not simply philosophical. It was also practical. By the 18th century, the spectacle of public execution was producing diminishing returns. Crowds still gathered, but they were increasingly rowdy, difficult to control, sometimes even sympathetic to the condemned rather than horrified by them. The message that spectacular punishment was supposed to send obey authority or face destruction was being received differently than intended. The new systems of punishment that emerged, imprisonment, transportation, eventually rehabilitation, were no less concerned with social control than the old systems. But they accomplished control through different means, not through spectacular destruction of the body, but through systematic management of populations, through surveillance and discipline, through techniques that Michel Foucault would later analyze as characteristic of modern power. The sawing disappeared. But the impulse that produced it, the desire to use the suffering of individuals to control the behavior of populations, did not disappear. It adapted. It found new forms. It persists today in systems that we do not always recognize as descended from medieval torture chambers. Understanding Heinrich's death helps us see this continuity. The system that killed him was not alien to our civilization. It was foundational to it. The assumptions that justified his execution, that authority must be obeyed, that defiance must be punished spectacularly, that the body of the condemned belongs to the power that judges him. These assumptions did not vanish when the sawing was abolished. They went underground, embedded themselves in institutions, and continue to shape how we think about crime, punishment, and the relationship between individual conscience and collective authority. Remember Heinrich of Freiburg. Remember the 31-year-old blacksmith who refused to forge weapons for a war he believed was unjust. Remember the 17 days he spent in a dungeon, knowing exactly what awaited him, preparing his soul and his family for his death. Remember the 2 hours he spent hanging upside down in Strawber's Market Square while thousands watched and executioners methodically sawed through his body. Remember that he refused to acknowledge the justice of his sentence even as the saw touched his flesh. Remember that his crime was conscience. For Ulrich of Constance, 29 years old, sawed for counterfeiting, denied burial because he died cursing rather than forgiving. For Conrad of Basel, 34 years old, sawed for attempted poisoning, who endured 2 hours and 15 minutes because his body was strong. For Friedrich of Speyer, 41 years old, sawed for heresy, who sang hymns until his voice gave out. For Georg of Mainz, 26 years old, sawed for murdering a priest, whose weakened body brought him merciful brevity. For the dozens of others sawed throughout Europe, whose names are lost, whose stories are fragments, whose suffering is documented only in legal records and execution accounts. For Margarita, who watched her husband die and carried the memory for 34 years. For Johannes, who rebuilt his father's fort and named his son after the man the system destroyed. For Katharina, who fled to a city where no one knew her name. For Peter, who never escaped his father's shadow and died young under circumstances the records do not clarify. For every family member of every condemned man who had to continue living after watching what was done to their loved ones. For the crowds who watched the thousands of ordinary people who came to witness suffering as entertainment, who were changed by what they saw, who carried the trauma forward into generations that eventually produced us. For the children who were lifted onto parents' shoulders to watch men being sawed in half, who learned that such things were normal, who grew up in a world where extreme cruelty was legitimate response to deviance. For all of us who inherited the systems, the assumptions, the unexamined beliefs that medieval justice built on bodies like Heinrich, they were not statistics, they were not lessons, they were not warnings, they were human beings, men with names and families and lives that were destroyed by systems designed to destroy them. Their suffering was not justice, it was power demonstrating its capacity for cruelty. Their deaths were not necessary, they were expedient. Their erasure from memory was intentional because power always hides what it does to maintain itself. Our remembering them is necessary because they were real. This is what the most disgusting punishment in history actually involved. This is what it did to the men who suffered it and the communities that witnessed it. This is the heritage we inherited, whether we acknowledge it or not. When you think about crime and punishment, when you consider what society has the right to do to those who break its rules, when you evaluate the systems of justice that govern your own life, remember this. Remember that the systems we have now grew from systems that saw men in half. Remember that the assumptions we hold about authority and obedience, about crime and punishment, about the body of the condemned, these assumptions have a history. Remember that forgetting enables repetition. Remember Heinrich. Remember, subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand medieval justice without understanding what it actually meant to die under medieval law. Remember that history is not just about the powerful. Remember that the condemned had stories too. Remember that every system of justice is built on the bodies of those it destroys. Remember.